When I walked into that boardroom 3 months ago and saw 27 investors staring at financial projections that proved my former boss's adopted son was about to destroy a $40 million company, I knew my decision to speak up would either save everyone's future or end my career forever. What I didn't expect was how a spoiled 28-year-old with no business experience would use his family connections to nearly ruin everything his adoptive father had built over 2 decades. The rain was pelting against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the 32nd floor conference room, and the gray Seattle skyline seemed to mirror the dark mood that was about to engulf everyone in that room. My name is Sarah Chun, and for 8 years I worked as Senior Financial Analyst at Morrison Tech Solutions in downtown Seattle. The company occupied 3 floors of the Columbia Center, with panoramic views of Elliott Bay and the Olympic Mountains on clear days. We specialized in cloud infrastructure for mid-sized businesses, and under the leadership of CEO Robert Morrison, we had grown from a small startup operating out of a cramped office in Pioneer Square to a respected player in the Pacific Northwest tech scene. Robert was more than just a boss to me. He was a mentor who recognized my analytical skills and gave me opportunities to prove myself in a male-dominated industry where being a young Asian American woman often meant having to work twice as hard to earn the same respect as my colleagues. I had started at Morrison Tech fresh out of graduate school at the University of Washington, where I had earned my MBA with a concentration in corporate finance. Robert hired me when the company had only 37 employees, and I watched it grow to over 200 talented professionals who genuinely cared about their work and their colleagues. The company culture was built on collaboration, innovation, and mutual respect. Robert made it a point to know every employee by name, and he regularly held informal coffee sessions where anyone could discuss ideas or concerns directly with him. Please subscribe to our channel to help us bring you more real stories like this one, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support means everything to us as we continue sharing these experiences. The trouble began in early March when Robert announced that his adopted son Marcus would be joining the company as Vice President of Strategic Development. The announcement came during our monthly all-hands meeting in the main conference room, where the entire staff had gathered on a particularly gloomy Thursday afternoon. Marcus had just graduated from business school at Northwestern, but his resume was surprisingly thin on actual work experience beyond a few summer internships at companies where Robert had personal connections. Robert explained during the staff meeting that Marcus had fresh ideas and would help modernize our operations to compete with larger firms that were increasingly targeting our market segment. I remember the uncomfortable silence that filled the conference room as veteran employees exchanged glances. Jennifer Martinez, our head of operations who had been with the company for 12 years, shifted uncomfortably in her chair. David Park, our senior developer who had helped build many of our core systems, stared down at his notebook and avoided eye contact with anyone. The silence stretched on for nearly 30 seconds before Robert continued his presentation about quarterly performance metrics and upcoming client presentations. We all knew this was nepotism, but Robert had always been fair with us and had never made decisions that seemed to favor personal relationships over business sense. So we decided to give Marcus a chance. The first red flags appeared even before Marcus officially started working at the company. During his final week of business school, he began sending emails to department heads requesting detailed reports about their operations, budget allocations, and strategic priorities. These requests came without any coordination with Robert or explanation of how the information would be used. When I asked Robert about Marcus's requests, he seemed genuinely surprised and said that his son was just being proactive in preparing for his new role. Marcus arrived on a rainy Monday morning in late March with an attitude that immediately set everyone on edge. He was tall, well-dressed in expensive suits that probably cost more than most of our employees made in a month, and carried himself with the confidence of someone who had never faced real consequences for his actions. His first day included a tour of our offices, during which he made comments about the outdated furniture in the common areas and suggested that the company needed to upgrade its image to attract top-tier talent. These comments seemed particularly tone-deaf given that our existing employees had built their careers at Morrison Tech and took pride in the company's down-to-earth culture. During his first week, Marcus scheduled individual meetings with each department head, including me. He had been given a corner office that had previously served as a conference room for smaller client meetings. When I walked into his new workspace, I was surprised to see that it had been hastily redecorated with expensive furniture, including a massive mahogany desk that looked like it belonged in a law firm rather than a tech company. Marcus barely looked up from his laptop when I entered, and he kept typing for nearly 2 minutes before acknowledging my presence. The conversation was uncomfortable from the start. Marcus asked me about my educational background, my previous experience, and my long-term career aspirations. He seemed particularly interested in whether I had considered pursuing opportunities at larger companies, which struck me as an odd question for someone who was supposed to be building team cohesion. When I mentioned that I enjoyed working at Morrison Tech because of the collaborative culture and opportunities for professional growth, Marcus nodded dismissively and said something about how ambitious professionals eventually outgrow smaller companies. During our 30-minute meeting, Marcus also asked detailed questions about our financial reporting processes, client billing procedures, and how we tracked profitability across different service lines. These were reasonable questions for someone in his position, but the way he asked them suggested that he was looking for problems rather than trying to understand our existing systems. When I explained that our financial reporting had been praised by external auditors and that our billing accuracy rate was above industry standards, Marcus seemed disappointed rather than pleased. The meeting that changed everything happened 3 weeks later, on a Wednesday afternoon in mid-April. Marcus had been pushing for what he called a revolutionary pivot in our business model, and he had scheduled a presentation for the senior leadership team to outline his vision for the company's future. The presentation took place in our main conference room with Robert, Jennifer, David, our head of sales Michael Chun, and myself in attendance. Outside, a typical Seattle spring rain was creating streaks on the windows, and the late afternoon light was already beginning to fade. Marcus's presentation was polished and professional, clearly drawing on techniques he had learned in business school. He used buzzwords like market disruption, vertical integration, and scalable growth models, while showing colorful charts and graphs that looked impressive but contained very little substance when you examine them closely. His central thesis was that Morrison Tech needed to abandon our steady revenue streams from existing clients and chase after high-risk contracts with tech giants like Amazon, Microsoft, and Google. The proposal involved taking on projects that were far beyond our current capabilities, including cloud infrastructure management for companies with millions of users and data security consulting for organizations that handled sensitive government contracts. Marcus argued that these enterprise-level clients would provide the kind of prestigious references that would allow us to charge premium rates and attract world-class talent to our team. He seemed to believe that our current clients, mostly mid-sized businesses with annual revenues between $10 and $50 million, were somehow beneath the company's potential. What bothered me most about Marcus's presentation wasn't just the unrealistic scope of his ambitions, but his casual dismissal of the relationships and expertise that had made Morrison Tech successful. He referred to our existing clients as stepping stones and suggested that we should gradually phase out our current service contracts to focus entirely on pursuing larger opportunities. When Michael pointed out that our current clients provided reliable, recurring revenue that allowed us to maintain financial stability, Marcus responded that stability is the enemy of growth, and that successful companies need to be willing to bet big to win big. I spent 2 weeks running detailed financial models on Marcus's proposal, working late into the evenings and through the weekend to make sure I had considered every possible scenario. The numbers were devastating and painted a picture of potential financial catastrophe that kept me awake at night. We would need to borrow nearly $15 million to fund the expansion, which would require hiring at least 60 new employees, leasing additional office space, and investing in technology infrastructure that we had never used before. Even in the most optimistic scenario, assuming we could win contracts with all of the target clients Marcus had identified, we wouldn't see profits for at least 18 months. The worst-case scenario, which my analysis suggested was significantly more likely than Marcus seemed to believe, showed potential bankruptcy within a year. The math was simple but terrifying. If we failed to win the major contracts that Marcus was counting on, we would be stuck with massive overhead costs and debt obligations that our existing revenue couldn't support. I ran the numbers multiple times, adjusting variables and assumptions to see if I could find a path that made Marcus's plan viable, but every model led to the same conclusion. When I requested a meeting with Marcus to present my analysis, he seemed annoyed that I had spent so much time on what he called worst-case thinking. The meeting took place in his office on a Friday afternoon, and I had prepared a comprehensive presentation that walked through my financial projections step by step. I showed him charts that illustrated how our debt-to-revenue ratio would become unsustainable, graphs that demonstrated the cash flow problems we would face during the transition period, and scenarios that explained what would happen if we failed to win the contracts he was targeting. Marcus dismissed my analysis without even looking at the spreadsheets, leaning back in his expensive leather chair with a smirk that I found deeply unsettling. "Sarah, you're thinking like an accountant, not a visionary," he said, using a tone that was both condescending and dismissive. "Sometimes you have to take big risks to achieve big rewards. My father didn't build this company by playing it safe and worrying about every possible problem that might never happen." "Sarah, you're thinking like an accountant, not a visionary," he said, leaning back in his leather chair with a smirk. "Sometimes you have to take big risks to achieve big rewards. My father didn't build this company by playing it safe." I tried to explain that Robert had actually built the company through careful planning and calculated risks, not reckless gambling with investor money and employee livelihoods. I mentioned specific examples of how Robert had grown Morrison Tech gradually, always ensuring that we had sufficient cash flow to support new initiatives before committing to major expansions. I pointed out that our current business model had allowed us to weather economic downturns and industry changes that had destroyed many of our competitors. Marcus cut me off mid-sentence and told me that he expected my full support for his initiatives, regardless of what my financial analysis might suggest. He said that questioning his strategic vision was counterproductive, and that successful team members needed to buy into the leadership's direction, even when they didn't fully understand the reasoning behind major decisions. The conversation had shifted from a professional discussion about business strategy to what felt like a personal attack on my competence and loyalty. When I insisted that I couldn't recommend such a risky strategy to Robert or to our investors, Marcus's demeanor changed completely. His friendly facade disappeared, and he looked at me with the kind of cold calculation that I had never seen from him before. He told me that my negative attitude and resistance to change were exactly the kind of problems that prevented companies from reaching their full potential. He suggested that perhaps I wasn't the right fit for a forward-thinking organization that was ready to play in the big leagues. The next morning, I arrived at the office to find an email in my inbox that had been sent at 11:30 the previous night. The message was brief and formal, informing me that I was being transferred from senior financial analyst to junior budget coordinator, effective immediately. The new position came with a corresponding salary cut of 22%, the loss of my private office, and a significant reduction in my responsibilities and decision-making authority. The email was copied to Human Resources and to Robert, though I suspected that Robert had not been involved in the decision. The demotion was humiliating and financially devastating, but what bothered me more was watching Marcus systematically steamroll through opposition from other experienced employees who dared to question his judgment. Jennifer Martinez, our head of operations who had been instrumental in developing many of our client management processes, was reassigned to a lesser role after questioning the timeline for Marcus's expansion plan. She had pointed out during a staff meeting that hiring 60 new employees in 6 months would strain our training capabilities and could compromise the quality of service that our existing clients expected. David Park, who had been with the company for 6 years and had designed much of our core infrastructure, was moved to a different department when he suggested that we should test the new business model with smaller clients before committing to contracts with major corporations. David's concerns were based on technical expertise and practical experience, but Marcus treated his suggestions as personal attacks on the strategic vision that would transform Morrison Tech into a major player in the industry. Robert seemed oblivious to what was happening. He was preparing for a major presentation to our board of investors and spent most of his time in closed-door meetings with potential clients. Marcus had convinced him that the dramatic expansion was necessary to compete with larger firms, and Robert trusted his son's judgment. The few times I tried to voice my concerns, Robert would politely listen but ultimately defer to Marcus's expertise in modern business strategies. The situation reached a breaking point in early June. Marcus had scheduled a presentation for our investors, 27 individuals and firms who had collectively invested over $40 million in Morrison Tech Solutions. He planned to unveil his expansion strategy and request additional funding of $15 million. The presentation was scheduled for a Thursday afternoon, and Marcus had specifically requested that I not attend, claiming that junior-level staff weren't needed for strategic discussions. That Tuesday evening, I made a decision that would define my career. I had been working late in my reduced-capacity role, updating budget reports that nobody seemed to read anymore, when I overheard Marcus on a phone call with someone he called Brad. Through his half-open office door, I could hear him bragging about how he was going to completely transform this boring little company and show these old-school investors what real ambition looks like. What I heard next made my blood run cold. Marcus was discussing backup plans in case the expansion failed. He mentioned that he had been in contact with competitors who might be interested in acquiring Morrison Tech's client list and intellectual property. He seemed to view the company not as his father's life work, but as a stepping stone to something bigger. If his risky expansion plan failed, he apparently had no qualms about selling off the pieces. I spent that entire night putting together a comprehensive report that outlined every flaw in Marcus's strategy. I included detailed financial projections showing how his plan would likely bankrupt the company within 18 months. I documented the pattern of demotions and reassignments that had removed experienced voices from key positions. Most importantly, I included transcripts of conversations I had witnessed where Marcus discussed contingency plans that involved dismantling the company if his expansion didn't work out. The report was 37 pages long and included charts, graphs, and financial models that told a story of reckless endangerment of investor funds. I knew that presenting this information would likely cost me my job, but I couldn't stand by and watch Marcus destroy everything that Robert and our team had built. I also couldn't let innocent investors lose their money because of one person's ego and inexperience. The morning of the investor presentation, I arrived at the office early and made copies of my report for each of the 27 attendees. I placed them in a conference room down the hall from where Marcus's presentation was scheduled to take place. Then I sent a brief email to each investor, explaining that I had prepared an alternative financial analysis of the proposed expansion and inviting them to review it before making their funding decision. Marcus's presentation began at 2 o'clock that Thursday afternoon. I watched from my desk as he confidently strode into the conference room wearing his most expensive suit. Through the glass walls, I could see him gesturing enthusiastically as he walked the investors through his expansion timeline. Robert sat at the head of the table, looking proud of his son's apparent confidence and vision. About 40 minutes into the presentation, I noticed several investors leaving the main conference room and walking toward the room where I had left my reports. Word was apparently spreading about the alternative analysis I had prepared. Within 20 minutes, nearly half of the investors had stepped out to review my documentation. The mood in the main conference room was visibly shifting. When Marcus finished his presentation and opened the floor for questions, the atmosphere had completely changed. Linda Vasquez, who represented one of our largest investment groups, was the first to speak. She held up my report and asked Marcus to explain the discrepancies between his projected revenues and the more conservative estimates I had prepared. Marcus glanced around the room, clearly realizing for the first time that his audience had been reading my analysis. "I'm not sure what document you're referring to," Marcus said, his confidence faltering. "Our projections are based on industry growth patterns and our company's proven track record." James Morrison, no relation to Robert despite the shared surname, raised his hand next. He wanted to know why Marcus's plan required firing or demoting several employees with extensive experience in the company's core operations. Marcus stumbled through an answer about bringing in fresh perspectives and modernizing our human resources approach. The questions kept coming, each one more pointed than the last. Investors wanted to know about the backup plans I had mentioned in my report. They asked about the projected timeline for profitability and what would happen if the major clients Marcus was counting on decided not to renew their contracts. With each question, Marcus became more defensive and less coherent. Robert looked increasingly uncomfortable as he realized that his son's presentation was falling apart. I could see him trying to understand how the investors had learned about internal discussions and strategic alternatives that Marcus had apparently never shared with him. The trust between father and son was cracking in real time. The meeting ended without any funding approval. Instead, The investors requested a 2-week period to conduct their own due diligence review of both Marcus's expansion plan and my alternative analysis. Several investors approached Robert privately after the formal meeting ended, expressing concerns about the leadership transition and the company's strategic direction. I knew the consequences would be swift. Marcus stormed out of the building without speaking to anyone, and Robert asked to see me in his office within minutes of the investor's departure. I expected to be fired immediately, but instead found Robert sitting behind his desk looking exhausted and confused. "Sarah, I need to understand what happened in there," he said quietly. "How did our investors get access to internal financial projections that I haven't seen?" I explained everything to Robert over the next 2 hours. I told him about Marcus's dismissive attitude toward experienced employees, the pattern of demotions for anyone who questioned his strategies, and the phone conversation I had overheard about backup plans that involved selling off company assets. Robert listened without interrupting, occasionally asking for clarification or additional details. What hurt Robert the most wasn't the business implications of Marcus's poor judgment, but the realization that his son had been making decisions without considering the impact on the people who had helped build the company. Robert had always prided himself on treating employees as family, and learning that Marcus viewed them as disposable obstacles was devastating. The next morning, Robert called an all-hands meeting to address the situation. He announced that Marcus would be taking a leave of absence to reassess his role within the company structure. He also reversed all of the demotions and reassignments that Marcus had implemented, restoring Jennifer, David, and me to our original positions with back pay for the reduced salaries we had received. The investors ultimately decided not to fund Marcus's expansion plan, but they didn't withdraw their existing investments either. Instead, they worked with Robert to develop a more gradual growth strategy that built on the company's existing strengths, while still pursuing new opportunities. The approach was less dramatic than what Marcus had proposed, but it offered sustainable growth without risking the financial stability that had made Morrison Tech successful. Marcus never returned to the company. Robert eventually told me that his son had decided to pursue opportunities in California, where he believed his innovative thinking would be better appreciated. I suspected that Robert had quietly helped Marcus find other employment to avoid further embarrassment for both of them. The aftermath of those events taught me valuable lessons about corporate courage and the importance of speaking up when you see problems developing. I had been terrified of the consequences when I decided to prepare that alternative analysis, but staying silent would have been far worse. Watching inexperience and ego destroy a successful company would have been a betrayal of everyone who had worked hard to build something meaningful. Robert and I developed an even stronger working relationship after the crisis. He began including me in higher-level strategic discussions and eventually promoted me to Director of Financial Planning, a role that gave me more influence over the company's long-term direction. He often told me that my willingness to challenge Marcus's plan had saved not just the company, but also protected him from making decisions that would have haunted him for the rest of his career. Morrison Tech continued to grow steadily over the following years. We did eventually expand our services and hire new employees, but we did it gradually and sustainably. The company maintained its reputation for reliability and quality service, which attracted new clients without requiring the desperate gambles that Marcus had proposed. By the time I left to start my own consulting firm 3 years later, Morrison Tech had doubled its revenue while maintaining the financial stability that investors valued. The experience also changed how I approach workplace conflicts and professional relationships. I learned that loyalty to a company sometimes means disagreeing with the people in charge, especially when their decisions could harm everyone involved. I also learned that preparing thorough documentation and presenting facts objectively can be more powerful than emotional arguments or personal attacks. Looking back, I realized that Marcus's arrival at Morrison Tech was a test of everyone's character and values. Some employees chose to keep their heads down and avoid conflict, which I understand given the power dynamics involved. Others, like Jennifer and David, tried to raise concerns through normal channels but were silenced before they could make an impact. I was fortunate to be in a position where I could compile comprehensive evidence and present it directly to the people who had the authority to make changes. The investor presentation that changed everything happened on a typical rainy Seattle afternoon, but the effects rippled through the company for months afterward. Employees who had been demoralized by Marcus's leadership style gradually regained their confidence and started contributing ideas again. The collaborative culture that Robert had originally established slowly returned as people realized that their expertise and opinions were valued once more. I often wonder what would have happened if I hadn't overheard that phone conversation about Marcus's backup plans. Would I have found the courage to challenge his expansion strategy based solely on the financial analysis? Or would I have continued to accept my demotion and hope that someone else would eventually speak up? I like to think that my commitment to the company and my colleagues would have eventually motivated me to act, but I'm grateful that I didn't have to find out. The story of Morrison Tech and Marcus's failed power grab serves as a reminder that family businesses face unique challenges when it comes to leadership succession. Robert's love for his adopted son created blind spots that nearly cost him everything he had worked to achieve. At the same time, Marcus's sense of entitlement and lack of real-world experience made him dangerous in a position of authority that he hadn't earned through merit or accomplishment. Today, I run my own financial consulting firm that specializes in helping family-owned businesses navigate succession planning and strategic decision-making. I often share the Morrison Tech story with clients who are struggling with similar dynamics. The key lesson is that family relationships and business relationships require different skills and boundaries. What works at the dinner table doesn't necessarily work in the boardroom, and successful family businesses learn to separate emotional connections from professional accountability. The courage to speak up in that situation came from understanding that my job was ultimately less important than the welfare of the company and all the people who depended on it for their livelihoods. Marcus's expansion plan would have put dozens of families at risk if it had failed, and the investors deserved to understand those risks before committing additional funds. Sometimes being a good employee means risking your employment to protect the larger organization and everyone connected to it. The conference room where I distributed those reports has been renovated since then, but every time I visit Robert for lunch or consultation meetings, I remember the nervous energy I felt that morning when I made copies for 27 investors. It was one of those moments that define a career and a character. I'm proud that I chose to act on my convictions rather than prioritize my own job security, and I'm grateful that the outcome validated the risks I took to protect something bigger than myself.